The sound of desperation cracked through the stillness of a Spokane morning. It was just before 6 a.m. on August 13, 2020, when the calm of the neighborhood was shattered by a call that rushed into the city's 911 dispatch center. On the other end of the line was chaos, screams, sobs, frantic pleas for help. A woman's voice trembled as she tried to explain, but her words dissolved into panic. A man was bleeding, she cried. He had been stabbed over and over again. She begged for someone, anyone, to come quickly before it was too late. The dispatcher strained to piece together the fragments. A location, a name, the chilling confirmation that the assailant was still at large. In the background, gasping breaths and muffled groans of pain told their own story. The life of a young man was hanging in the balance, every second dripping away like the blood on the floor where he lay. Before we dive into this disturbing case, I want to hear from you. Do you believe it's ever safe to let an online relationship move too quickly, to the point of inviting someone into your life after only weeks of knowing them? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, because your perspective might just open up an angle others haven't considered. And if stories like this grip you the way they grip me, make sure you subscribe and hit the notification bell, because what you're about to hear will leave you questioning the darkest corners of human impulse. When officers arrived at the modest Spokane home, the street outside was still and silent. No screams carried through the air, no commotion spilled onto the sidewalk. But as they pushed open the door, the horror revealed itself. Inside, the bedroom was soaked in crimson. On the floor lay 25-year-old Anthony, his body nude and riddled with stab wounds, his chest rising and falling with desperate, uneven breaths. A woman in a blood-soaked robe hovered over him, trembling and pleading for help. Her name was Haley, his estranged wife. And somewhere beyond those walls, barefoot and fleeing into the early light of morning, was the man she called her boyfriend, a 19-year-old named Eddie Martinez. The scene was a portrait of violence and confusion. Medics rushed into the room, their hands moving quickly as they applied chest seals over wound after wound, each one bubbling with the sound of air struggling to escape. They shouted for more supplies, for more hands, for more time. Anthony's body was marked by stab after stab, his strength slipping away as the bedroom walls bore witness to the frenzied attack. Officers guided Haley outside, her robe sticking to her body with blood that was not her own. In the front seat of a patrol car, she stared at the ambulance as it pulled away, whispering over and over, "Please, he didn't deserve this. Please save him." When detectives asked her who had done this, her answer was clear. Eddie, 19 years old, from Sacramento, a boy she had met online only weeks earlier, who she had driven across state lines to bring into her home. He had been living there for 2 months now, under the same roof as her and her not-yet ex-husband. And in the early hours of that August morning, the volatile triangle between them had erupted into bloodshed. But this story doesn't begin with the screams of a 911 call or the flashing lights of patrol cars. To understand what led to Anthony's final moments, you have to step back. You have to see how the threads of an impulsive romance, a fractured marriage, and a teenager searching for belonging wove themselves into a rope strong enough to strangle 3 lives at once. It began online, where Haley and Eddie first connected. For her, he was attention and excitement, a new chapter waiting to be written. For him, she was escape, a woman who seemed to understand him, who offered him a way out of Sacramento and into something he thought resembled love. It took barely more than a week of conversation before Haley made the reckless choice to drive all the way down to California, scoop him up, and bring him into her world in Spokane. For Eddie, it felt like fate. For those who would later look back on it, it was the spark that would ignite catastrophe. At first, the arrangement seemed bizarre, but manageable. Haley lived with Anthony, though they were in the middle of a divorce. She insisted it was amicable enough, that Anthony didn't mind. Eddie, young and impressionable, accepted the story. But beneath the surface, the cracks were already there. A fractured marriage, a new relationship moving too fast, and the unstable balance of 3 people trying to share a space built for 2. As weeks passed, tension simmered. Eddie began noticing text messages between Haley and Anthony, messages he didn't want to see, words that stirred jealousy and insecurity. He confronted her about them, but she brushed him off, telling him not to worry. Still, the seed had been planted. Eddie was young, volatile and insecure, and the idea of competing for Haley's attention, especially with a man who had once been her husband, was gasoline on the fire building inside him. On the night of August 12th, everything that had been simmering finally boiled over. Gin flowed freely in the house. They smoked, they laughed, and at some point, Anthony pulled out a Ouija board. He joked about summoning demons, about inviting a presence into the house. To Eddie it felt wrong, unsettling, but he went along with it. Later, as the night wore on, the boundaries between the three blurred further. Haley made a proposition. She wanted to be intimate with Eddie, right in front of Anthony. For Eddie, the pressure was immense. He tried, but he couldn't perform. The alcohol numbed him, his body refused to respond, and humiliation twisted inside him. Anthony's attempts to join in only made it worse. Touches that felt invasive, words that pushed at his fragile pride. Eddie later told detectives he felt anger rising inside of him, a deep, simmering fury that drowned out reason. He stepped into the bathroom, and instead of collecting himself, he looked for a weapon. That was the moment when his choice was sealed. When Eddie emerged from the bathroom, he wasn't just another restless teenager anymore. He had made a decision in those few minutes alone, a decision that would end one man's life and destroy his own. He walked back into the bedroom, his hands empty, his expression neutral. But hidden on him was a knife, tucked away in a place no one would notice. Later, in interrogation, he admitted he had concealed it between his own body, pressed against his skin, smuggled back into the room as if he were a predator waiting for the right moment. The room was dim, lit only by the faint glow of a phone's flashlight. Haley was still on the bed. Anthony, bare, had not yet realized that danger had already returned with Eddie. Eddie sat down, his heart thudding, his mind racing. In that moment, he played it cool, pretending nothing had changed. He even picked up Haley's phone, offering to turn on the light. "Since you guys are doing this right here," he said, "you might as well change the view." It was the smallest of distractions, a line tossed into the air like bait. And Anthony took it. He shifted, turning his back toward Eddie, exposing himself in an instant of casual trust. That was all Eddie needed. The knife slid free, gleaming faintly in the pale light, and then it plunged forward. Anthony's body jerked as the blade bit into his back. "Ow, stop! What are you doing?" His voice was shocked, confused, a cry for reason. But Eddie was beyond reason. He stabbed again, and again, each thrust harder, faster, more frenzied than the last. Haley screamed, leaping off the bed, her voice cracking as she begged him to stop. "You're scaring me. Please, stop." But the frenzy had consumed him. Anthony stumbled forward, trying to escape the flurry of steel that carved into his body. He staggered around the bedroom, clutching at his wounds, gasping as blood spilled hot and fast across his skin. The room became a blur of chaos. Eddie lunging forward, stabbing relentlessly, Anthony struggling to get away, Haley sobbing and pleading. Each time the blade struck, a new wound opened, air whistling and bubbling from his chest as his lungs collapsed under the assault. Later, paramedics would say they had never seen so many chest seals used on a single person, each one pressed over holes that refused to stop bleeding. At some point, Anthony fell. His body collapsed to the floor near the bed, blood pooling beneath him. His breaths were shallow, ragged, broken. It was the sound of a man fighting for life, with everything he had left. He tried to speak, tried to beg, but the words turned into gasps. Haley dropped to his side, pressing her hands against his chest, her robe soaking up the blood until it clung to her body like a second skin. Eddie stood above them, the knife dripping, his chest heaving. For a moment he seemed to realize what he had done. He threw the blade onto the bed, his voice shaking as he turned to Haley. "You have to help me. I can't go to jail. Hide me. Get me out of here." Haley shook her head violently. "No. I need to help him. He's dying." But Eddie pressed closer, his voice cracking with desperation. "You have to take me somewhere. You can't just leave me. Please." Haley pulled away, clinging to Anthony's body as she reached for her phone, dialing 911 with trembling fingers. The line crackled as the dispatcher answered, her words tumbling out incoherently. "Please. He's been stabbed. He's not breathing well. Please. He needs help." On the other end of the call, the dispatcher tried to calm her. "Ma'am, I need you to breathe. Stay with me. Help is on the way." "Where is the suspect?" He ran out. "Please, hurry." The dispatcher could hear Anthony's labored breaths through the phone, could hear the wet gurgle of blood with every inhale. It was a sound no one in that room would ever forget. By the time police arrived, Eddie was gone. He had fled barefoot into the early morning air, shirtless, wearing only denim shorts and loafers. The streets were quiet, the neighborhood still asleep, unaware of the predator who had just slipped past their homes. Inside the house, officers found Haley trembling, blood smeared across her body, her face pale with shock. They coaxed her outside, urging her to show herself so they could make sure the suspect wasn't hiding nearby. She resisted at first, too afraid, too shaken, but eventually she stepped into the night air, her body lit by the flashing red and blue of squad cars. In the bedroom, Anthony lay nude on the floor, his chest barely rising. One officer crouched down, pressing his fingers against Anthony's neck. "I've got a pulse. Faint, but it's there," he shouted. Medics rushed in with supplies, kneeling in the blood as they worked. They tried to seal his wounds, one after another, but there were too many. 14 in the chest and abdomen, 5 in the back, 1 in his arm. The knife had carved him open like prey, leaving little chance for survival. Still, they worked. They lifted him onto a gurney, carrying him carefully through the narrow hallway, out into the night. Haley stood frozen, her eyes locked on him as the doors of the ambulance slammed shut. She whispered his name, her voice barely audible, her body trembling with guilt and grief. Eddie, meanwhile, was already blocks away, his bare feet slapping against the pavement, his breath ragged in the cool air. He had no plan, no safe house, nowhere to go. He had been in Spokane for only 2 months, a stranger in the city, and now he was running with blood still fresh on his skin. At some point, he found a phone, not his own, but one borrowed from a stranger in an alley, and dialed a number not for police but for family. Hundreds of miles away in Sacramento, his mother picked up. "I'm running for my life," he told her, his voice panicked. "They're after me." It wasn't long before Spokane police received the call from their Sacramento counterparts, relaying the bizarre message Eddie had given his family. He was in Spokane, somewhere near Wesley Avenue, possibly hiding near a park. Officers swarmed the area, K-9 units searching, a drone buzzing overhead. And then, quietly, without resistance, Eddie was found. Barefoot, disheveled, trembling, he surrendered without a fight. Back at the house, officers processed the crime scene. Blood was everywhere, spattered on the walls, soaking the sheets, smeared across the floor where Anthony had tried to crawl away. On the bed, the knife lay abandoned, its blade still glistening. On the living room table, the Ouija board sat untouched, a grotesque reminder of how the night had begun. As the sun rose over Spokane, Anthony's life slipped away in a hospital bed, and Eddie's life as a free man ended in handcuffs. What had begun as a night of alcohol, drugs, and blurred boundaries had ended in a killing so brutal it would haunt everyone who touched it. At the Spokane police station, Eddie sat alone in a small gray interrogation room. The camera above him captured every twitch of his hands, every nervous glance, every muttered word. At times he seemed calm, almost detached, his voice low and steady. At others he spoke to himself, whispering fragments of sentences no one else could understand, as if someone unseen sat across from him. Detectives watched from behind the glass, debating what they were seeing. Was this the behavior of a teenager in shock? A manipulator rehearsing excuses? Or a young man whose mind had already fractured before the crime ever took place? When Detective Bryan entered, Eddie straightened. The detective introduced himself, explained the room was being recorded, and began reading Eddie his rights. For a moment, Eddie hesitated. He said he wanted a lawyer. Sesnick nodded, prepared to end the interview. But then, as if on impulse, Eddie blurted, "Wait. No. I know what I did. I'm not going to deny it." And just like that, the story began to spill out. He started with the drinking. 4 shots of gin, he recalled. A strong bottle, not the cheap stuff, the kind that burned all the way down. Then the smoking. THC wax, hot and heavy, inhaled until his body went numb. "I couldn't even feel anything," he admitted. "Like my body just shut down." He remembered Anthony pulling out the Ouija board, remembered the way Anthony talked about summoning demons, about calling on something named Zozo. To Eddie it felt wrong, like they were inviting darkness into the room. But he laughed it off at the time, convinced himself it was just part of the night. Then came the intimacy. Haley propositioned him, wanting him to have sex with her in front of Anthony. For Eddie, the pressure was enormous. He tried, but his body refused. The alcohol dulled him, and nothing happened. "I couldn't get hard," he confessed bluntly. The humiliation gnawed at him, especially as Anthony sat nearby, watching, touching, laughing. What should have been awkward at worst twisted into something else entirely. Eddie felt anger boiling inside him, a deep resentment that grew with every second. Anthony's presence, his touches, his confidence, it all became unbearable. Eddie excused himself to the bathroom. Detectives leaned in as he described what happened next. "I went in there, and all I could think about was finding a knife," he said flatly. Like my brain wasn't even giving me another option. He admitted he wasn't looking for space to cool down. He was hunting for a weapon, He found one, a folding utility knife, small but sharp, with a silver blade. And instead of carrying it openly, he concealed it. I hid it between my ass cheeks, he explained without hesitation, his tone disturbingly matter-of-fact, so they wouldn't see me walk in with it. Detectives exchanged glances. The detail was so specific, so bizarre, that it cut through any claim of sudden impulse. Eddie hadn't snapped in a split second. He had planned. He had hidden the blade. He had returned to the room with intent. I sat back down like nothing happened, Eddie continued. I even grabbed her phone, turned on the light, distracted them. I told them they should change the view. That's when he turned his back. And then, without warning, he struck. I just did what I never thought I would do, he said quietly. I stabbed him. Over and over. I couldn't stop. He described Anthony's reaction, the way he cried out, begging for him to stop. He described Haley's screams, her frantic pleas. He admitted he chased Anthony as he tried to flee around the room. I felt like nothing mattered, Eddie muttered, his voice low, like I just didn't care anymore. I said fuck it, and I kept going. But the rush, he said, didn't last. For a moment it felt like hunting, like the times he had taken down deer as a boy. He compared the stabbing to snapping an animal's neck after a kill, describing how it once gave him a surge of adrenaline. But this time, the surge collapsed almost as quickly as it came. Reality returned. Anthony was bleeding out on the floor, Haley was screaming, and Eddie was holding a knife dripping with blood. I miss him, Eddie admitted in a strange twist. He was an all-right friend. I don't know why I did it. I couldn't stop. Detectives pressed him on motive. Why? Why take it this far? His answers shifted like sand. At one moment he said Anthony had pressured him, touched him in ways that made him uncomfortable. At another, he claimed he had been protecting Haley, that Anthony was trying to take advantage of her. But even as he said it, his words contradicted themselves. The truth was harder to pin down. The detectives asked about Haley, what their relationship had really been like. Eddie's face softened. He admitted he loved her, that he felt connected to her from the start. And then, without prompting, he dropped a bombshell. She's pregnant, he said. I think we're going to have a kid. The room went still. Whether it was true or not was unclear, but the declaration added another layer to an already tangled web. If Eddie believed Haley was carrying his child, what would he have done to protect that relationship? What would he have risked to keep her from drifting back to Anthony? When asked if Haley had played any role in the stabbing, Eddie shook his head. No, he said firmly. She didn't know. She was scared, but she knew something was wrong with me. She could see it in my face before it happened. I was already thinking about it. That detail, more than anything, stuck with investigators. Eddie admitted that even before he left the room for the bathroom, he had been planning. Haley had noticed something in his expression, a look that told her something terrible was coming. He had been thinking about killing Anthony even before he found the knife. As the interview wound down, detectives left Eddie alone. He hunched over the table, his hands covering his face, his voice trembling as he spoke to himself. He wept, muttered about being a father, about wanting to go back to Haley one day. He scribbled a letter meant for her, pouring out apologies and promises from inside the interrogation room. I'm coming back to you, baby, he whispered to himself. I'll be back home to you and our child. But the reality was already set. Detectives returned to explain the charges. Eddie Martinez would not be going home. He would not be walking back into Haley's life. He was being booked on first-degree premeditated murder, a charge that carried the weight of decades behind bars. Eddie stared at the table, silent. For the first time since the interrogation began, he had nothing left to say. The wheels of justice turned slowly, but they turned all the same. In the weeks after Anthony's death, investigators built their case piece by piece. Crime scene photographs revealed the brutality in graphic detail, the blood-soaked carpet, the crimson-streaked walls, the knife abandoned on the bed. Autopsy results confirmed what the medics had seen that morning. 20 stab wounds. 14 to the chest and abdomen, 5 to the back, 1 to the arm. Fatal damage inflicted by a teenager who claimed he, quote, couldn't stop. Haley became a key witness. Her testimony from the night of the attack was chaotic, at times contradictory, but undeniably crucial. She told detectives how she begged Eddie to stop, how she tried to shield Anthony, how she had refused Eddie's pleas to hide him afterward. To Anthony's family, though, her words rang hollow. They looked at her not just as a witness, but as the person who had brought Eddie into Anthony's life in the first place. One relative said bluntly in an interview, She created this situation. She is just as responsible for this as he is. Others echoed the sentiment, furious that Haley had invited a 19-year-old stranger into her home, allowed him to live under the same roof as Anthony, and blurred the lines of intimacy until disaster struck. To them, Haley wasn't just unlucky, she was reckless, and her recklessness had cost Anthony his life. Still, prosecutors focused their sights on Eddie. The evidence of premeditation was overwhelming. He had admitted to retrieving the knife, concealing it, and using deception to lure Anthony into turning his back. He had confessed to feeling the rage building long before the stabbing began. And his words, about hunting, about the rush of taking a life, left little room for a defense of sudden impulse. As the trial approached in April 2023, the courtroom filled with a heavy silence. Anthony's family sat together, their grief raw, their eyes fixed on the young man who had taken so much from them. Eddie entered in shackles, older now than when he was first arrested, but still only in his early 20s. He carried himself with a strange mix of defiance and resignation, as if caught between wanting to explain himself and knowing that no explanation would matter. Prosecutors laid out the story for the jury, step by step. They played Haley's frantic 911 call, the audio filled with screams and desperate pleas. They showed the body cam footage of officers entering the house, the moment they found Anthony gasping on the floor, the blood that coated every surface. They recounted Eddie's own words from the interrogation, the admission that he had planned, that he had hidden the knife, that he had stabbed until he lost control. The defense tried to paint a different picture. They spoke of Eddie's mental health, of his troubled thoughts, of his claims that he sometimes felt like someone else was inside his head. They pointed to the alcohol and drugs that night, the Ouija board, the bizarre mix of influences that blurred Eddie's reality. They argued that he was young, unstable, and pushed into a situation no teenager should ever have been in. But the jury could not ignore the facts. Eddie wasn't just drunk. He wasn't just high. He had made deliberate choices. Choices that took him to the bathroom in search of a weapon. Choices that led him back into the room concealing that weapon. Choices that ended in 20 stab wounds on the body of a man who had once been a friend. For Anthony's family, sitting in that courtroom was agony. They listened as medical experts described the wounds in detail, as paramedics recalled the futile attempts to save him. They saw the photos projected on screens, each one a reminder of the final moments of his life. Some wiped tears silently, others shook their heads in anger. The pain was visible in every line of their faces. Haley testified as well, recounting the night with a mixture of tears and trembling. She spoke about how Eddie changed in an instant, how his face darkened with something she couldn't recognize, how he pinned her down and demanded she help him escape after the stabbing. She insisted she had refused, that she had chosen instead to cling to Anthony and call for help. The courtroom listened, though not everyone believed her. For some, her words felt like self-preservation. For others, it was the only sliver of redemption she had left. After days of testimony and hours of deliberation, the verdict came. Guilty. First-degree premeditated murder. The words landed heavy in the courtroom, but they carried with them a sense of inevitability. Eddie Martinez had confessed in his own words. The evidence had painted the picture clearly. The jury had no other choice. The sentencing followed. Prosecutors argued for decades, pointing to the brutality of the crime, the premeditation, the sheer number of wounds. The defense begged for mercy, reminding the court that Eddie was still young, that he had the potential for rehabilitation. But the judge, weighing the gravity of the crime, delivered a sentence that would shape Eddie's life, 27 years in prison. For Anthony's family, it was justice, though far from closure. 27 years was a long time, but to them it was not enough to balance the loss of a son, a brother, a nephew. Anthony would never come back. His life had been cut short in a storm of blood and betrayal, and no number on a judge's paper could erase that. Eddie, for his part, seemed almost resigned. He didn't erupt in anger. He didn't beg for forgiveness. He simply nodded, as if accepting a fate he had already known was coming. In letters written afterward, he spoke of Haley, of how he still hoped to return to her one day, of how he dreamed of seeing a child he believed she was carrying. He spoke of love, of longing, of a future that had already slipped beyond his reach. But in reality, Eddie's future was cemented in concrete and steel. He would spend the bulk of his adult life behind bars, his name forever tied to the brutal murder in Spokane. In February 2025, he filed an appeal, clinging to the hope that something might change. But the Court of Appeals upheld both his conviction and his sentence. 27 years, no less. As for Haley, she remained a figure clouded in suspicion and pity. To some, she was a victim who had been caught in a nightmare, forced to watch as the man she once loved was slaughtered before her eyes. To others, she was the architect of her own tragedy, a woman whose reckless choices had brought disaster into her home. Either way, her life was forever scarred by the events of that night. And Anthony, he became a name, etched into court documents, police files, and news reports. But to his family, he was more than that. He was a man who had chosen a career in corrections, who had tried to live responsibly, who had dreams that would now never be realized. His loss left a void no sentence could fill. When the trial ended and the courtroom emptied, the weight of the story lingered. It was more than just a crime. It was a lesson in how fragile life is, how quickly choices can spiral, how a single night can destroy 3 lives at once. As we step back from the courtroom and look at the full picture, the questions remain. Could this have been prevented? Was it a matter of love turned toxic, of pride wounded beyond repair, of youth colliding with recklessness? Or was it something darker, something always lurking inside Eddie, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself? What's certain is this: in a quiet Spokane neighborhood on August 13, 2020, the boundaries of trust, intimacy, and loyalty shattered. And in their place, a family was left grieving, a young man was left condemned, and a woman was left forever haunted by the choices she made. Before we close, I want to hear from you. Do you think Haley bears responsibility for what happened that night? Or is Eddie alone to blame for the violence that unfolded? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I'll be reading them, and I know this case will spark a lot of debate. And if you found this story as chilling as I did, make sure you like this video, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next story we uncover. Your support helps keep these stories alive, and together we can shed light on the cases that should never be forgotten.